Hello friends. So one of the videos on line breeding and inbreeding on my channel got 26,000 views 2 years ago, which was really amazing. That I didn't expect such a large number of views on this topic, and other videos on my channel get a lot less views. So I figured this topic is something people want to inquire about. Now, I don't know if the person watching is a breeder or a casual person who wants to know genetics or what the target audience is, but I figured I'm going to follow up that earlier video which got 26,000 views. I made some other videos in this series which explain things through graphs and explanations, but I never really covered the mathematics of how this works. Why is this important? When you're breeding dogs, it's all about percentages. You're not going to find the perfect male and the perfect female to make the perfect conformation in your dog or the perfect temperament in your dog. So breeding is about selection, man-made selection, artificial selection, as opposed to natural selection, which is what happens in nature. So when you're doing man-made selection, you're looking for certain attributes, both in temperament and structure. So for example, let's say you find, and we're talking about breeds in general, not a specific the German Shepherd breed or some other breed. We're talking about breeding in a very general sense right now, irrespective of the breed. So let's say you have a dog which has a great top line, has a great temperament, very high prey drive, which is desirable in the German Shepherd, for example, for working purposes. Let's say has a very good stifles, very good pasterns, but let's say has a very weak chest. The chest is caved in, but has a good bite, has a good grip, high prey drive, and high intelligence. Now, is this dog the perfect specimen? No, it's anatomically has a very shallow chest, and you would want to breed him to a female with a deeper chest, right? Which complements him because her structure complements with her strength his weaknesses. But will that necessarily pass on to the puppies? Well, maybe a quarter of the puppies will have the conformation from the mom. The other 3/4 would be some from the dad, some as a mix between the characteristics of both. Some will look more like the grandparents or the great-grandparents even. So when you're breeding a litter of pups, they're not clones of each other. They are their own DNA. They're only 50% related to each other. And the genes they get are not necessarily the exact same gene pairs from each parent. So when you're breeding dogs, whether you're focusing on a female line or breeding through a male line, some people focus on the male line. I like focusing on the female line because I feel the female is more important in the breeding program than the male. I'll explain that in a minute. But both are valid. It's just a matter of preference, and there's a difference in your approach in both strategies. I'll explain that in a minute. But anyhow, if you watch video 3A of my series, you will watch mechanisms tied to the male line. Video 3A in the series, a link will appear below. But anyhow, so dogs is about percentages. So what percentage of the pups will have the attributes from this parent and that parent, and that when you continue the pup in the next generation, that attribute will pass on. Well, to create enough dogs which are fit for the purpose you're breeding them for, you have to have a goal. When you're breeding dogs, you must have a goal. Without a goal, what are you breeding? You must have an ideal dog in your mind in terms of structure, temperament, drive, sociability, anatomical structure. You have to have a goal in mind. What is your goal for your breed or your line of dogs of your breed that you're creating? If you're always pairing together unrelated dogs because you're afraid of line breeding or inbreeding, and the dogs have no genetic connection to each other, then you can never achieve any goal, because those dogs will not reproduce themselves in the slightest. You think they will, but they won't, because there's no prepotency in the dogs. There's no ability to pass on homogeneous genes. In other words, constantly outcrossing dogs to the latest famous name doesn't produce results. For example, a very popular stud dog today is Bola Janaka in the German Shepherd breed. I see a lot of people now breeding to him. Well, if you breed to him once and you don't see him in both sides of the pedigree, or you see him repeated in the pedigree, he's not going to pass himself. He's no longer the sire at this point in time. He's now a grandsire or a great-grandsire. So his influence is very small, because as a great-grandsire, his percentage of genes is a tiny fraction. Say, well, I have a Bola Janaka line. No, you don't. You have a single dog bred once to that dog. That doesn't make a line. A line is some common ancestors, perhaps as many as 2 or 3, repeated several times in the pedigree in the 4th and 5th generation, repeatedly repeated in the mother's and father's side. That's a line, when you see the same dogs over and over several times in the pedigree. At that point, they have enough contribution because of being repeated several times that they can be considered a line. When you see a dog which has the same three great-grandparents or grandparents repeated several times, that is a line. If you see that dog once in the pedigree and it's a famous dog, that's not a line. Some famous lines are Ming van Hausfeld. That was a famous German Shepherd in the early 90s. Firo was a famous German Shepherd. Karl van Fingelhoff was a famous German Shepherd. So people nowadays are breeding the latest fad dog. This dog is the WSV winner, and therefore his offspring must be good. So they're breeding title to title. Well, you're not breeding titles. Titles are done through training. If you go back to biology, there was a famous biologist named Lamarck. He was a competitor of a contemporary at that time, which was named Charles Darwin. Lamarck felt that an animal could pass on attributes that it could be acquired in life. In other words, let's say a giraffe stretches its neck to reach the high leaves on the branch. And by constantly stretching its neck, it'll pass on genes for a longer neck to its offspring. That's what Lamarck felt. That animals can evolve quickly as they change to adapt to their environment, and it can be done as many as in one generation. Darwin felt it would take thousands of generations for the environment to exert enough pressure for the animals to change and adapt to the environment, where the genetic change to the environment is slow. Now, who was right? Was Darwin right, or was Lamarck right? Well, if Lamarck was right, and I become a bodybuilder, which, as you can tell, I'm not a bodybuilder, but let's say I was a very muscular guy, full of muscles. Now, will my son, who was born to me, come out of the womb full of muscles? Obviously not, right? Obviously, it's a trait I acquired by exercising my body with weightlifting, not something I can pass on to my son. So, let's say I became a top physicist in the world, and I became a world-renowned physicist. Will my son or daughter born to me become physicists? No. That's a matter of learning and education. So acquired traits through education in a human being, or through physical exercise that you acquire. Let's say you become a fast runner, or you become a very strong built, like a bodybuilder. You cannot genetically pass that. That's something you acquired. That's not something that you can genetically pass. So Lamarck was wrong, and his theory was disproven, and Charles Darwin was right. So basically, what it's saying is that you breed a WSV German Shepherd male to the WSV female. Now, they both got the highest possible title, the World Championship, not a regional championship, not a local championship, not a country championship, the World Championship. Now, on paper, they should be good, right? Both champion dogs. In reality, they will not pass on their genes, because the genes that you are looking for are not done through training the dog. They had world-class trainers teaching them those skills at a very high level. Had the same 2 dogs been given to a less powerful trainer, which was not world-class, then their characteristics, even though they're innate genetically, would have not been developed to the highest extent. So your goal of breeding is to allow the animal to reach its highest genetic potential. Now, not every trainer is world class and can breed a dog and can train a dog to the highest possible potential. So then, what can you do as a breeder if you're not a world class trainer? So people are breeding dogs based on titles. Totally wrong. Not saying titles are not important, but if you're breeding based on titles, you're not breeding with any logic. Because some dog would be a title dog 3 years from now. Is that going to be the new target for your breeding program? Because you're breeding based on titles? Oh, he's hot, he must be the best dog. You're not accomplishing any kind of logic in your breeding. Now, so having said that, we're going to discuss the following topics. Wright's versus Hardyman's coefficient of inbreeding, topic 1. And I'll compare the two and contrast them. Topic 2 will be the mathematics of calculating coefficient of relationship versus coefficient of inbreeding. That'll be topic 2. Topic 3 will be how to improve a breed based on understanding these percentages. Because your goal is to improve a breed through line breeding. Your goal is not just simply to breed to produce puppies. You can do any 2 dogs and produce puppies. Why are you creating a line of dogs? What are you trying to accomplish? What is your goal? So you have to have a clear understanding of what your goal is in order to understand what the hell you're doing. So we're going to see how these percentages, because no dog is perfect, so it's a game of, so genetics is a game of percentages. That's why I'm explaining a mathematical approach to this. And you'll see what a line is as I explain it. So let's go forward. Now, so the first step is, Sire Wright lived in 1922, and he developed an equation for the coefficient of inbreeding that I think he was hired by the U.S. Agricultural Department to prevent the cow herds from being too inbred. I believe that's where I read. I have to read my notes. In the description of this video, there will be a link to an article explaining it very, very well. I invite you to look at that link at the end of the video, at the bottom of the video. Now, getting back to what is the similarity to Wright's method and Hardyman's method? Hardyman lived wrote an equation in the year 2000, 78 years later. So there's 80 years approximately between this equation and this equation. Now, Wright's method does not put a limit on the number of generations you go back in time when calculating repeated ancestors. Hardyman's equation puts a limit of 5 generations and no more. That's one key difference. Let's explain how that works. In Wright's equation, if there's a common ancestor 4 generations ago, the inbreeding coefficient could be 3.27%. You go back 5 generations, it's 4.54%. You go back 6 generations, it's 6.37%. You go back 7 generations, it's 7.75%. You go back 8 generations, it's 8.72%. Because the more you go back in time, the greater the odds of having common ancestors. In other words, you have 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents, 16 great-great-grandparents, and so forth. The number is always getting bigger. But the number is not going to grow to 1 billion. In other words, if you go back enough in time. The number is going to go back not by that degree. And so your odds of running into a common ancestor increase the further you go back in time in the same breed. Anyhow, so 10 generations, the inbreeding coefficient is 15.82%. 15 generations, 28.28%. Now keep in mind, a father bred to his own daughter or a mother bred to her own son, that's only 25%. So this is a 28.28%, more than the direct breeding of mother to son or father to daughter. So this tells you how incredibly wrong this is. Because if you do 28.28% in 15 generations, that looks like a very heavily inbred dog, doesn't it? 20 generations, 32.53%. This is more than a father to daughter or mother to son mating. So obviously, if you go 20 generations and you have a 32.53% coefficient of inbreeding, and there's no close breeding in the first 5 generations, but there's a 32.53% in 20 generations, do you really think these dogs are really that related, that they're only related 20 generations ago? The answer is no, they're not. So that's the biggest problem between Wright's equation and Hardiman's equation. Wright's equation doesn't place a limit of how far back you go in time, creating the artificial impression that the dogs are more related than they really are. Most pedigree databases and most software to solve coefficient of inbreeding, like BreedMate for example, use Wright's equation, not Hardiman's equation. But keep in mind, it's been surpassed as time went on. So having said that, let's go and put some other names on the board. And one second. Okay, I got the eraser. Sorry for that interruption. So other scientists have come along since Wright, who did it in 1922. One of them was Medlicott in 1948. Another scientist came along named Kudo in 1962. Another came up in Kudo and Sakaguchi, a Japanese scientist. They figured out that the X chromosome has more payload than the mother and father combined. And they wrote a modified equation of Kudo taking into account X-born genes. In other words, the mother carries more genetic payload as a sex-linked chromosome through the X chromosome. Their equation is the same equation as this, but modified with the fact that the female has more genetic payload than the male. So if you want to look it up, Kudo and Sakaguchi figured that out. There's an equation they wrote. I invite you to look it up if you want to. And then Ballou wrote an equation in 1997. And then finally, Hardiman wrote an equation in 2000. So that's some historical context that I invite you to read about. So, okay, so enough with the intro. So what is the difference between Wright's equation and Hardiman's equation without getting too much into mathematics? Statistics and mathematical modeling of gene flow is a complicated topic. What qualifies me to speak to this topic? I was a physics major and had a lot of courses in mathematics, including statistics. So I'm not a biology major, but I was a physics major. And I have a good understanding of statistical modeling and statistics. I'm not going to explain it that deeply in this video. I'm just going to give you a quick, very high-level summary that you can take away from this video. But I do have a very good math background. I also have a degree in electrical engineering. And as a science major in my earlier days, I had a lot of classes in biology. And now as a breeder, I see all that math that I took coming back to me. Because now I have a reason to use it and understand it. So, with that said, what are the differences between Hardiman and Wright? So, one of the first differences you can tell is the difference is this is only 5 generations and no more, as I showed you earlier. The other difference, this is infinity. There's no limit on the number of generations. The next difference is the position in the pedigree. This one does not care what the position is in the pedigree as long as it's in the male and female side of the pedigree. Now that's not quite right because, for example, if you're following Wright's equation, the top of the pedigree is the male pedigree and all the male ancestors, parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, and so forth. And the bottom of the pedigree is the female part of the pedigree. And Wright's equation only works for a common ancestor if it appears here, and that same name appears here too. In other words, it has to be common to the male and female in order to create a homogeneous gene pair. Now, what if the male pedigree has no line breeding whatsoever, but the female pedigree has one common ancestor that she's inbred on, we'll call it ancestor A, another different ancestor that she's inbred on, we'll call him ancestor B. And yet a third ancestor, which is inbred upon, which we'll call ancestor C. Now, this female has inbreeding in her, or line breeding in her. Remember, line breeding is a milder version of inbreeding. So the female carries line breeding in her on these three ancestors. The male doesn't. Because these three, or none of these three, appear here versus here, in Wright's equation, that would be no inbreeding in that pedigree. The inbreeding coefficient would be 0. But Hardyman's equation takes care of inbreeding no matter where it appears in the pedigree. That's another key difference. Sorry for the dog barking, she's okay, she just wants a little attention. So, the other difference in the, well, let's get back to how the math works, which is the start of this video. So the first thing we're going to do is calculate the coefficient of relationship. And we're going to do the coefficient of inbreeding, not by calculating it as it's done on a computer, because you can't do it in your head. You need a computer program to do it. It's too difficult to do it when you do it too many generations back. You could do it for recent generations maybe, but if it's a very long pedigree, you need the computer software. So I'm going to approximate this. I'm not going to do it exactly. I'm going to approximate the COI from the COR, and it is close enough that you can take something away from it. All right. So what is the coefficient of relationship? So let's say we have a common sire, and there are two different females that he's bred to, which have offspring, female 1, female 2, and they have pups. Let's say 11 pups here, and 9 pups here. This is an example. And you'll cross some of these female pups with some of these male pups and vice versa. In other words, they're half siblings. And the common male is the common sire. Well, how many generations away they are from this male? Well, they're 1, 2, 1, 2. In other words, the pups are considered what's called 2-2 line breeding. In other words, the common ancestor is 2 generations away from them. So you would call this a 2-2 breeding, which is a half sibling breeding. And you would write it as this: 1/2 squared plus 1/2 squared, where the generation vector is the power of 1/2 squared. Why 1/2? Because you get half the genes from your mother and half the genes from your father. You don't get all your genes, you get half of them, right? Now, so that's 1/4 plus 1/4, which is 2/4, which is 1/2, which is 50%. So the coefficient of relationship is 50%. Well, that's right. He's half of both half siblings. He's the common ancestor. What is the COI if the COR is 50%? The COR, this is approximately, not exactly, but the COI is 0.25 times 0.50. In other words, it's a quarter of this number. So the COI is, so if you do it as a decimal, if you do it as a fraction as opposed to a percent, it's a quarter times a half, sorry for my sloppiness, which becomes 1/8. And what's 1/8? 1/8, if I'm not mistaken, is 12.5%. Okay, so now, so the half sibling mating is 2-2, the COR is 50%, and the COI is 12.5%. That's a quarter of that, okay? What's another inbreeding, not line breeding, inbreeding? Another inbreeding is 1-3 or 3-1. The father of this, remember on the left is the male, the number on the right is the female. The father of this dog is the grandfather of this dog, or the grandmother of this dog is the, this is basically a grandparent to grandchild. Either a grandfather to granddaughter or a grandson to grandmother. So you're breeding a female back to her own grandfather. Well, how does that work? We're gonna, since it's the same, just the numbers are reversed, we're gonna write it out. 1/2 to the first power and 1/2 to the third power. which is any number with the first power is the number itself, as you know. So this is 1/2 plus 1/8. And as you know, 1/2 is 4/8, right? Plus 1/8, which is 5/8. And this becomes the coefficient of relationship is, I believe, 62.5%, if my math is right. This is a 1/3 or a 3/1. I can flip the numbers the same thing. So the grandfather is 50% as the father, because he's a 1. So here he is 50% as the sire. And his granddaughter carries 12.5% of him, because he's now the grandfather of her. So he comes in 50% as the father and 12.5% as the grandfather. 50 plus 12.5 is 62.5%, or 5/8. So this is a 5/8 dog. So now a grandfather to granddaughter mating. If you were to do it one more time, it would be a 7/8 dog, or an 87.5% dog. So what does that look like? 1/3, and I'm not going to write 3/1, is 62.5%. Now, 1/4 of this number is actually a higher number. But so the approximation doesn't work in this example. But again, the COI is 12.5%. So if you calculate using the actual formula, not using an approximation. Now what's the difference between 12.5% here versus 12.5% here? Here you have two fresh lines coming in because you have two different moms, same sire. Here you're cutting down the mother line, only focusing on the father line. So it's the so what does COI mean? Out of the 50% of the genes, 12.5% of them are homogeneous, meaning they line up as the exact same gene pairs from both sides. So the genes are total genes from this ancestor are 50%, but 12.5% are homogeneous. Next example. Next example is 3/3, first cousins. Common grandfather. So this again, using the same method, 1/2 cubed plus 1/2 cubed is 1/8 plus 1/8, which is 2/8, which is 1/4, which is 25%. Okay, so first cousins, the grandfather, is 25% of 1/4 of all the genes. Well, that's right, there are 4 grandparents. Paternal grandmother, paternal grandfather, maternal grandfather, maternal grandmother. So he's one of 4 grandparents. That's right, he's 25%. But how many of his genes are homogeneous? Well, you do 0.25, again as before, times this number, times and this is no longer percent, just 0.25. 0.25 is 25%. 0.25 times 0.25, which becomes 6.25%, or 0.0625. So the COI for first cousins is 6.25%. The COR is 25%. If you notice, 6.25 is a quarter of 25%. So the COI in this example is again a quarter of the COR. Next example. 4/4, second cousins. Well, same method. 1/2 to the 4th plus 1/2 to the 4th, which is 1/16, plus 1/16, which is 2/16, which is 1/8, which is what's an eighth? 6. Let's see. 1/8. 12.5%. Okay, that's the COR. So a not a grandfather, a great grandfather is 12.5% of all the genes in the great grandkids. What's the COI? The COI is 0.25 times 3.125. I'm converting between fractions, decimals, and percentages pretty quickly in my head. If this is a little too quick for you, pause the video and do the math yourself. I convert quickly between decimals, fractions, and percentages, but if this is a little fast for you, just pause the video, punch it into a calculator, and you'll see what I'm doing. Now, so COI is 0.25 times 0.125, which is 12.5%. So we get 3.125%. So again, for second cousins, the COR is 12.5%, and the COI is about a quarter of it, which is 3.125%. 3 is about 1/4 of 12, roughly speaking, right? So now you can see that COI, only 3% of all the genes are homogeneous. So you see the number going down as you step back in time. Let's go to the last example, or actually next to last example. We're going to do 5/5. Third cousins. Which is 1/2 to the 5th plus 1/2 to the 5th, which is 1/32 plus 1/32, which is 2/32, which is 1/16. And I'll leave you to figure this out. I believe this is 6 1/4. And now, what's the COI? The COI is 0.25 times 0.0625, which is like 1.56%. Approximately, if my math is right. I'm doing this quickly and I'm doing it in my head, so if I did a little mistake, please forgive me. I'm not going to re-record this video. All right, so what does this all mean? Well, is this enough to create a line? Let's make a more realistic example. We have a dog, we'll call it dog A, dog, whatever, dog X, and it has a common ancestor, ancestor A, which is 4, 4, comma, 4, 4. Great-grandfather twice on the mom, and great-grandfather twice on the dad. This was obviously planned. This did not happen by itself. This is an intelligent breeder who is doing this. This is not something that just came up accidentally. Ancestor B, a different ancestor, could be a male or a female. Let's say this ancestor is a 5, 5. And then we have a third ancestor, ancestor C, and this ancestor is 4, 5, 5. Now, which ancestor gets the greatest influence of the genes of this dog? Well, let's figure it out. Ancestor A is 1/2 to the 4th power, 4 times, 1, 2, 3, 4, times 4. 1/2 to the 4th power is 1/16, times 4, times 4, it's not a power, this is times 4. 4/16, 4/16 is 1/4, which is 25%. So look at that. The same grandparent repeated 4 times as a great-grandparent has the same relationship as if he's a 33. In other words, twice second cousins is the same thing as first cousins. Just like twice first cousins is the same thing as siblings. He says, what is that? It's called a double first cousins in the example of human beings. What does that mean? If 2 brothers marry 2 sisters, their kids are cousins, but because both parents, the sisters are sisters to each other, the brothers are brothers to each other, that's called double first cousins, which is really half siblings. So even though they're cousins, they're actually brothers and sisters. If they're second cousins twice, it's the equivalent of being first cousins once. As we just saw the math. That's how it works out. Unless you do the math, that's not obvious. So what is this? This is 1/2 to the 5th power times 2. It's twice, right? So 1/2 to the 5th is 1/32, times 2 is 2/32, so this is 1/16. So this is 1/16 of the blood. This is 25% of the blood, or 1/4. What is this? This is 1/2 to the quarter, 1/2 to the 4th power, plus 1/2 to the 5th power twice, times 2. And I'll leave you to work it out yourselves. Now, which ancestor has the greatest influence from these three ancestors? Clearly this one. But this one is not far behind. So, what does that mean? Well, that means this dog is 100% of his own genes, right? But from this 100%, this ancestor is 25% of his genes. This ancestor is 16% of his genes. And this ancestor is 8% of his genes. I'm just doing this quickly now without doing the math. In other words, from his total genes, all the other ancestors, great-grandmothers, grandmothers, great-grandmothers, they all contribute to the remainder. But these three ancestors are the greatest. If you add it up and subtract it from 100, that's how much they have influence. That is what a line of dogs is. A line of dogs is a common, more than one common ancestor repeated several times. Like this is the same ancestor repeated several times. That is what a line of dogs means. The same ancestor, not once, not twice, but repeated several times, or multiple ancestors repeated several times, so that their percentage of the blood out of 100% has the greater effect than the other, all ancestors combined. So what do you get out of this? You get the best of both worlds. You're creating concentrating genes at, let's say, 50%, but the other 50% is a lot of other dogs, but a lot of other genes. So you're creating less risk than if you were to do inbreeding. What is tight inbreeding versus loose inbreeding or line breeding? I'm not going to explain inbreeding because I think you know what that means. I'm going to explain line breeding. So what is tight versus loose line breeding? Well, tight, an example of tight is 2-3, uncle to niece, or 3-2, aunt to nephew. Okay, what does that look like? Since this is the flip of that, I'm not going to change the formula now. So this is a half squared, this is the 2 right here, plus 1/2 cubed, this is the 3 right here, which is 1/4 plus 1/8, and as you know, 1/4 is 2/8, so this is 3/8, and 3/8 is 37.5%. So if you were to breed a father to a daughter, that's 75%, but you're concentrating on him. But if you breed his brother, which is the dog's uncle, the brother of my brother is the uncle to to me, but is the uncle to my daughter and son, right? You get that relationship, right? So by breeding to the uncle to the niece, the grandparents' generation is where you're concentrating on, not that dog, and that's at 37.5%. What does that kind of mean? Well, as a brother, he'd be 50%, right? But he's close to being a brother of the original dog at nearly 40%. That's the COR. What is the COI? Again, not using the formula, using an approximation. Well, it's 0.25 times 0.375, which is 9.3%, or 0.093 if you want to keep it in decimal form. It's 0.093. So this is an example of tight versus loose. So the COR for this combination is 37.5 with a COI of 9.3. Now, if you actually did the formula, it comes out Hardingman's is actually 9.63. So it's 0.33 bigger. But this estimate of using a quarter of the COR as the COI is close enough for government work, as they say. It's close enough. In other words, the COI is approximately 1/4 of the COR. Not precisely, but close. So, an example of tight line breeding is uncle to niece. That's pretty tight. 3-3 is also pretty tight, first cousins. 3-3. We already did this before, but I'll do it again. 1/2 cubed plus 1/2 cubed, which is 1/8, plus 1/8, which is 2/8, which is 1/4, which is 25%. So, that's common grandparent, 25%. The COR is 1/4 of that, roughly, as we showed you, which is 6.25%. So that's pretty tight. So these are considered tight in the breeding of dogs. What's considered loose? A loose line breeding is 3-4. Not quite first cousins, but not quite second cousins, kind of in between. So that would be 1/2 cubed plus 1/2 to the 4th, which is 1/8, plus 1/16. And as you know, 1/8 is 2/16 plus 1/16, which is 3/16. So this is not that tight. This is still line breeding, but it's not considered tight. This is considered a loose line breeding, not a tight line breeding. What's another example of loose line breeding? 4-4 is loose. 5-5 is loose. This is so far back it hardly has any influence. What's an example of also loose that a lot of showline German Shepherd breeders use? Well, the example I gave you earlier, 4-4, comma, let's say 4-5. In other words, that's still loose because this is far back in time. Or 5, comma 4. Still loose. It's repeated several times, but it's far, far back in time. So you are doing homogeneous gene pairs, but the percentages are small. Like I said, line breeding and inbreeding is all about percentages. That's why I took you through this exercise. So these are the difference between loose and tight line breeding. I'm not going to even bother covering inbreeding because I don't think you should do inbreeding at all. Because you're not creating a breed anymore. You're using existing breeds and you're trying to create excellence in an already excellent breed. For example, today's Belgian Malinois is already a very excellent breed. Today's German Shepherd is already a very excellent breed. You're not trying to recreate what already exists. You're not creating a new breed. Now, for example, if you were breeding the American Bully, which has Bulldog attributes and Staffordshire Terrier attributes and Pit Bull attributes, and you're creating a new breed, I think this breed was started in the 90s, that is a new breed. Then when you do want to tightly line breed and inbreed, because you're trying to solidify a breed which is not quite gelled yet. Some dogs look more like Bulldogs, some dogs look more like Terriers, so you're still trying to homogenize the breed. That would be an example where you do it. So it depends on the breed, and also, for example, take the Cumberland Spaniel. The Cumberland Spaniel, because there's so few of them in the world, it's already a very small gene pool. So you have to make an effort to not tightly inbreed, because the small gene pool means it's already tightly inbred. So that gets me to what's called the founding sire effect. Let's say we're living in the 1920s, 100 years ago, and one champion dog came up in the show ring. Well, every breeder of a bitch will breed to this stud dog. So therefore his blood will become common across a lot of dogs in that country. Now we live in the 1930s. Now another famous dog emerges as the famous dog. Now the bitches of that time are bred to this dog. By the way, I'm not using bitches in a pejorative way. A female dog is a bitch. There's no pejorative use of the word. Anyhow, so in the 1930s, there's one or two famous stud dogs, and they become the dominant blood of the females of that time period. Now, but these females are descendants of this dog, because he was used heavily. And so particular strain emerges or a particular bloodline. Now we're in 1940s and so forth. So every decade has a famous dog that is the model of the ideal type of that time period. An example is Gonta Weinerraum in the German Shepherd. He was the foundation dog of today's German Shepherd show lines. And the Martin brothers, I leave it up to you of what you think of them, were responsible for today's show line German Shepherd. Walter Martin and Herman Martin. Anyhow, this has been a quick overview. I'm not using the actual formulas. I'm giving you a quick and dirty problem-solving mechanism, just using fractions basically. Not using equations, not using fancy algebra, not using computers, just using my head. If you're a student of the subject, remember what you need to do. You have to have a goal. You have to breed out defects. You have to outcross or prevent genetic bottlenecks. You have to maintain a certain amount of purity in your line, or it's no longer a line. And you have to have a vision of what you're doing and why you're doing it. I hope this was instructive. Please watch the other videos in this channel. I'll link to some of the videos are in the description. Take care, have a great day.